When all doors closed, one cowboy dug hope out of the snow. Before we begin, comment your country so I know where this story is reaching. The winter that settled over Elk Hollow that year was harsher than anyone expected. Wind carved through the valley, snow packed against doors, and most ranchers kept to themselves. But nothing felt colder than the silence following Mara Lorne, wherever she went. A widow at 38, left with debts she didn't make, and a land deed stripped from her by a town that decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Folks didn't say it outright, but their sidelong glances told the truth clearly enough. Too much bad luck around her, they said. Let her manage on her own. She tried. She truly did. She moved into a small, abandoned shack at the edge of the ridge, a place meant for seasonal hands. Not a woman trying to rebuild a life, but it was all she could afford, and even then, barely. She patched the roof with old grain sacks, kept the stove alive with scraps, and told herself spring would come and she could just hold on. The problem was simple and brutal. Grief alone doesn't keep anyone warm. That's when Reed Carver first heard her name mentioned. Not kindly, not gently, but with that tone men use when they want to avoid feeling guilty. He was in town for supplies, tying down a crate on his wagon, when he overheard two shopkeepers muttering about the widow living up the ridge. Something about won't last long out there. Reed didn't care much for gossip, but those words, won't last long, sat wrong with him. He knew what it felt like to have people give up on you. Years back, after losing his own brother, he'd spent months drifting through silence and whiskey until he finally clawed his way back. He understood how easy it was to fall through the cracks. He drove his wagon home, but the thought didn't leave him. All evening he worked through chores, fed his stock, checked fences. But his mind kept circling back to the image of a woman alone in a half-rotten shack, while a snowstorm pressed in. By nightfall he was irritated with himself. By morning he was saddling his horse. He told no one where he was going. Didn't need to. He rode toward the ridge, following a narrow track nearly buried in drifts. The air stung, the kind that burned through gloves, and the cold carried a quiet that made every hoofstep feel louder than it should. When he reached the shack, he saw smoke rising, thin, weak, barely clinging to the sky. It wasn't the smoke of a warm house. It was the smoke of someone running out of firewood. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, louder. When Mara opened the door, she looked startled, not frightened, just tired in a way that made Reed's chest tighten. Her cheeks were wind-chapped, her hands wrapped in cloth, her hair pulled back simply because energy was a finite thing she couldn't waste. She looked at him like she expected he'd come to ask for something she didn't have. Reed spoke plainly. He asked if she needed help with firewood, asked if she'd eaten, asked nothing else. Mara hesitated. People didn't usually offer her anything without conditions attached. But she stepped aside and let him in because pride doesn't keep a home warm either. Inside, the room was small but tidy. The stove barely glowed. A thin blanket lay folded on the bed, and still, despite everything, there was a quiet dignity in the way she moved around the space. Reed warmed his hands, then grabbed an axe from beside the door without asking. He walked back outside and began splitting what little which he had left. The rhythm steadied him. The silence didn't bother him. And Mara watched through the window, unsure why a stranger would do for her what her own neighbors never had. When he brought in the first armful, she asked him the question sitting in her eyes since he arrived. Why? Reed shrugged like it was no grand thing. He told her no one should face winter alone. That was all, but it was enough to shift something inside her, something she thought had frozen solid months ago. And outside, the snow kept falling, but for the first time all season, the cold didn't feel unbeatable. Reed didn't return the next day. He returned that same afternoon. Mara had spent the morning convincing herself his visit was a one-time kindness, something polite men did before moving on with their lives. But when she heard the soft crunch of hooves in the snow, her breath caught, and she wasn't proud of the small flicker of relief that moved through her. Reed walked in with a burlap sack of dry kindling and a pot wrapped in cloth. He didn't make a speech about it, didn't try to impress her. He set the pot on her table, unwrapped it, and the smell of warm stew filled the shack. Mara hadn't smelled anything that generous in months. She tried to refuse at first. Old habits die hard. People had taught her that every gesture came with a hidden cost. But Reed just ladled a bowl for himself and another for her, and sat like he expected nothing more than shared silence. It worked. She ate. Over the next week, Reed kept showing up at the same quiet pace, never forcing conversation, never asking for her story, and never treating her like a burden. He fixed the loose hinge on the door, reinforced the window frame with an extra board, helped her haul water from the frozen creek. Always steady, always calm, always stopping before she felt crowded. Mara noticed he never sat too close, never overstepped, always let her choose the distance. And slowly, almost against her will, her mind began to ease from the constant knot of fear and exhaustion. The shack grew warmer. The nights felt shorter. She even laughed once, briefly, quietly, when Reed tripped in a snowbank and pretended he meant to do it. For Reed, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The more he helped, the more he found himself waiting for a smile at the doorway. He reminded himself this wasn't about him. She needed support, not complication. Still, the way she held her mug with both hands, the way the fading light brushed her cheek, the way her eyes lingered on him a half-second longer each day. He wasn't blind, but he was patient. One evening, the sky dimmed early, thick with clouds that promised another storm. Reed arrived with an armful of split logs. Mara was stitching a torn sleeve in the dim firelight, her fingers pale but steady. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression softened, unguarded. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Reed set down the wood. "Maybe not, but I will." Her eyes lowered. People stopped showing up. That's just how it goes. Then they were the wrong people. The words landed harder than he intended. Not sharp, not romantic, just truthful in a way that pulled her breath from her chest. The wind outside began to rise, sweeping snow against the walls. Reed stepped to the window to check the sky. "Storm will hit before midnight," he said. "You need anything before I ride back?" Mara swallowed, her hands trembling slightly around the sleeve she'd been mending. "Stay a little longer," she said, barely above a whisper. Reed didn't move at first. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to misunderstand her. When he turned, she was looking at him with a mix of fear and longing. Fear of needing someone again, longing to not spend another storm alone. He sat beside the table, giving her space but not distance. The quiet between them felt different now. Not empty, not cold, just honest. The storm hit hard. Snow rattled against the eaves. Mara lit an extra candle. Reed tightened the stove damper and added wood. The small shack felt like the only warm place left in the valley. As the wind howled, Mara finally asked a question she'd been holding back. "Why me? You don't even know me." Reed's voice stayed low, steady. "You're someone who deserved better than being left out here to freeze." Her eyes glistened, not from sadness, but from the shock of being seen. And for the first time since the day her old life fell apart, she didn't feel like an abandoned widow. She felt like a person someone cared to notice. The storm raged on, but inside that small room, something thawed that no winter could break again. If you're still here, make sure to like and subscribe. The storm lasted 2 days. Wind hammered the shack through the night, and drifts climbed halfway up the walls. Mara barely slept. Not because of fear this time, but because Reed stayed to the worst of it. Quiet, steady, reshaping the air of that little room simply by being in it. They spoke in pieces, never forcing anything. Mara shared small details of her past. Her late husband's long illness, the debts others pinned on her, the slow unraveling of everything she once believed was safe. Reed listened without flinching or offering pity. He didn't try to fix the past. He simply accepted it, which was something she hadn't felt in years. By the second night, the wind eased, but the world outside had transformed into a frozen silence. Mara lit the stove again, while Reed stepped out to check the sky. When he returned, snow sparkled on his shoulders like scattered grains of light. "Road's buried," he said. "I'll dig out in the morning." Mara nodded, though something in her chest tugged at the thought of him leaving. She wasn't used to wanting someone to stay, not out of desperation, but because the space beside her felt emptier when he moved too far. The next morning, Reed cleared a narrow path from her door, working methodically. Mara watched him from inside, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm water. The sun rose slow and pale over the ridge, catching on the breath he exhaled. It struck her then how long it had been since someone cared enough to shovel even a single step for her. When he came back in, shaking off the cold, he looked more hesitant than she expected. He warmed his hands by the stove before speaking. "I need to get back to my ranch today," he said, "but I'll come tomorrow or the day after if the roads fight me." Mara swallowed, forcing a small nod. "You don't have to keep checking on me." "I know," he answered, "but I want to." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise he couldn't keep. It was simply the truth. He picked up his gloves, ready to leave, then paused in the doorway. Mara felt a sudden, unreasonable panic when she tried to hide, but Reed caught it anyway. "Mara," he said gently, "I'm coming back." He didn't add anything else. Didn't need to. When he rode off, the sound of hooves crunching through deep snow carried across the ridge like a slow heartbeat. Mara wrapped her shawl tighter, standing in the doorway long after he disappeared from sight. For the first time in a year, she felt something other than dread when she looked at the future. A week passed. Reed showed up 3 times, never late, never empty-handed. Sometimes with supplies, sometimes with tools, sometimes with nothing but a quiet smile. And Mara found herself waiting for those visits in a calm, steady way, like waiting for sunrise. One evening, when the thaw finally began, Reed arrived with a small box. His hat was dusted with melting frost, his coat unbuttoned from the warmer air. Mara met him at the door with a look that surprised them both. Open, hopeful, almost youthful. Reed set the box on her table. Inside was a simple wooden carving of a small cabin, shaped carefully, sanded smooth. "Found some scrap wood," he said quietly. "Thought you might want a fresh start, something to build toward." Mara touched the carving with gentle fingers. It wasn't the gift that undid her, it was the meaning behind it. A future, a place of her own, something no one else had ever offered. She looked at him, her eyes bright but steady. "Why would you do this for someone like me?" Reed stepped closer, not too close, just enough. "Because you aren't someone like anything. You're just you, and that's enough." That was the moment it happened. The shift she'd been resisting for months. She didn't fall into his arms. He didn't kiss her. The world didn't burst into drama. Instead, something gentler settled into place. A new beginning. A reason to breathe deeper. A spark stubborn enough to survive any winter. Mara closed the distance by a single step. Not bold, not timid. Just true. Reed's expression softened, as if he'd been waiting for her to make that choice on her own. Outside, the last of the snow slid from the roof. Inside, warmth rose in a way no stove could create. Reed stayed until the lantern burned low, talking with her about spring plans and small hopes. When he finally left, Mara stood in the doorway once more. Only this time, she wasn't watching a cowboy ride away. She was watching the man who dug hope out of snow find his way back home, knowing he'd return again. And she knew, deep down, that her own home would not stay empty much longer. The cold season was ending, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't just believe in spring. She believed in tomorrow,